We open our survey of the Long Island Railroad in the 1940s and 50s with some views at Mineola. Here we have an eastbound steam-hauled freight train, probably a 280 type, passing the high-level platforms at Mineola and crossing under the bridge at Mineola Boulevard. An eastbound passenger train also heading through Mineola, beyond which the main line diverges from the Oyster Bay line. There's a mainline train heading eastward from Mineola, and I believe this one is going to be an Oyster Bay train. No, this is a mainline freight passing the tower, the junction of the Hempstead branch and the Oyster Bay branch with the main line. There's another eastbound passenger train pulled by a G5 10-wheeler 460 type, leaving Mineola eastbound. And this one is an Oyster Bay train. You can see it taking the curve, heading northward up to Locust Valley and eventually to Oyster Bay. At Oyster Bay, the engine terminal was a favorite train watching spot, and there we have one of the 10-wheelers, a 47 Nash automobile, and what appears to be an Oldsmobile Sedanette of that same era. Here's an evening rush hour train arriving at Oyster Bay, again pulled by one of the G5 10-wheelers, the Pennsylvania Railroad's most successful type of commuter train steam locomotive, and many of which were used on the Long Island Railroad. The first car in this train was a parlor car, extra fare. The rest were all the arch roof ping pong type commuter cars. This is Fresh Pond Junction with a steam-drawn fan trip coming off the Montauk Division and entering onto the Bay Ridge Division, the New York Connecting Railroad, which was still electrified with overhead wire at that time. The train is heading southward, and this is most likely one of the many farewell to steam fan trips which were run in the early 1950s on various parts of the Long Island Railroad. This one is coming off the Montauk branch and onto the Bay Ridge Division. We'll probably head south to Bay Ridge Yard and then come back. Apparently the locomotive wasn't turned at Bay Ridge Yard, because here is the train coming back up the Bay Ridge Division. Here it seems to be passing the New Lots area of Brooklyn, with the engine running backwards, pulling the train backwards. Most likely the engine was just run around the train in Bay Ridge without turning it. We have steam-powered regular passenger service here on the Rockaway Beach Division over the causeway over Jamaica Bay. This has to be prior to 1950, because that was when the trestle burned and the service to Rockaway via Jamaica Bay had to stop. Service to Rockaway continued through Far Rockaway, however, on the line through Valley Stream. More views on the Rockaway Division, apparently around Ozone Park. Some trains were steam-drawn, others were electric, and some were diesel. Back at Oyster Bay again, late one evening, the Oyster Bay station. And an evening rush hour train arriving, again pulled by a G5. Once the steam engine arrived at the terminal, the locomotive was uncoupled from the train and was sent to the servicing area to dump ashes, shake the grates, put more coal and water into the tender, and otherwise service the engine, turn it around, and get it ready for the next run back to Jamaica. In the time-honored tradition, it's the fireman's job to work the water plug to put more water into the tender. And also to put more coal in the tender to keep the fire going. Diesels were starting to take over at this time in the early 1950s. It was a long, slow process of replacing steam engines with diesel engines on the Long Island Railroad. Here the fireman is still putting water into the tender of that G5. Although it appears to be a train leaving Oyster Bay, actually these are marshalling scenes in which the trains are juggled around the tracks and the locomotives are put on the correct ends to get ready for the next morning's rush hour service. There is that parlor car again, brought around to the front of the train, with the locomotive on this end of the train now, backing in. There's the fireman banking the fire, getting ready for storing the engine overnight. And the engineer in his usual seat on the right-hand side. More views of trains at Oyster Bay being switched from one track to another in preparation for the next morning's rush hour. These are views at Floral Park back in the late 1940s. Some Kodachrome film was exposed here of steam-drawn trains passing by. Some of the cars are still Tuscan red, others are in the later gray scheme. A Fairbanks Morse diesel locomotive pulls a train of freshly painted cars in the gray and white livery, the first change from the Tuscan red livery of the Pennsylvania Railroad. That jumping you see is not in your tape nor in your player. It's something in the original film, unfortunately, probably taken with a magazine-loaded camera. That's one of the Long Island Railroad's Alco diesel locomotives pulling a train through Floral Park. And after it passes, the gates go up. The Creedmoor branch was a favorite of those who planned Long Island Railroad fan trips. Originally, it had been part of a through railroad from Valley Stream all the way up to Flushing, the old Stewart Railroad, but that was abandoned in the 19th century except for the portion from Valley Stream up into the Creedmoor Hospital, which received many of its supplies, including coal, by train until much later in the 20th century. There in the distance is a Long Island Railroad mainline train passing through Floral Park near the junction with the Creedmoor branch. These freight cars are on a siding on the Creedmoor branch. Some switching is being done here, probably to add to these cars or get some of them out of there. And in a moment or two, we're going to see a couple of fan trips that will run up into the Creedmoor branch. Single track line from Floral Park all the way up into Creedmoor. Here's one such fan trip being pulled by a Long Island Railroad consolidation type freight engine, a 280, heading engine northward from Floral Park up into the Creedmoor branch. Notice the clean, freshly painted gray and white cars, the first gray livery from the Pennsylvania Railroad's Tuscan red with gold lettering. So this appears to be early 1950s. Here's another fan trip on the Creedmoor branch, backing up into the Creedmoor branch this time. This was already considered secondary track, so obviously any moves on it had to be made at slow speed. This locomotive appears to be one of the G5 10-wheelers. No, it's a 280 freight engine, I'm sorry, followed by a bunch of the neighborhood urchins running up the track after the locomotive, at least not causing any damage to it or to the railway. At Jamaica, a good spot to view Long Island Railroad trains on all the branches except the Port Washington and the Rockaway Beach branches. This is still in the steam era, although many of the cars have already been painted in the gray livery. Steam, electric, and diesel trains all came together here at Jamaica from the various branches. Some of the steam-drawn trains had exchanged their trains for electric locomotives here for service to Pennsylvania Station. These were trains that made their runs on non-electrified branches farther out on Long Island. Out on one of the branches, probably the main line, out around Mineola somewhere, possibly Maryland Avenue. Notice the position light signals, characteristic of Pennsylvania Railroad installations, which the Long Island Railroad was part of until mid-20th century. Again on the main line, probably around Maryland Avenue. Now at Hicksville in 1955, there was a ceremony marking the farewell to steam passenger service on the Long Island Railroad. 2 locomotives were selected, both G5s, number 35 and number 39. They were freshly repainted, complete with aluminum paint on the smoke boxes, and both were selected for preservation. The Boy Scouts of America, a local chapter, brought about Operation Changeover, Boy Scouts Rail Jubilee, in 1955, and here we are just east of Hicksville Station, with number 35 and 39 facing each other on the main track. It was a rainy day, and various speeches and ceremonies were made. The 2 locomotives then came together head to head. The Boy Scouts were allowed to inspect the cabs of the locomotives. And then the 2 locomotives went off into history, both to be preserved. One of them at the Stony Brook Museum, the other one on display in Salisbury Park. In the 1990s, both locomotives were slowly undergoing rebuilding for excursion service on Long Island once again. This is still at Hicksville, it's still the same ceremony. Now we have a look at more Long Island Railroad electric operations. This is a view taken in the Forest Hills area, looking toward the Empire State Building in Manhattan, way off in the distance, in the late 1930s. The purpose was that the Long Island Railroad had a two-level car built, number 200, and a couple of others, and were demonstrating their use. Notice the Long Island Railroad MU train here. The old railroad roof cars still had their freestanding classification lamps. And there is the very first Long Island Railroad split-level car. They were generally called double-deckers on the Long Island Railroad, but that's not a correct name for them. They had only one floor level, with the upper seats 3 steps above the floor level and the lower seats 3 steps below floor level. By staggering the seat arrangements this way, they could accommodate many more seats in one car than on a train with flat floor with only one single level of seats. This is about 1939 or 40, demonstrating the operation of these cars. After World War II, a whole fleet of them was acquired. They were not very popular with the public, though, especially those who had to ride in the lower seats. On rainy or snowy days, they would get splashed with water from passengers walking back and forth with wet shoes or boots, passing them on the aisles. The seats were quite cramped, but of course they were intended for relatively short commuter runs, not for long distance services. All of these have long since been retired from service, but here we are looking at a demonstration of them back in the late 1930s or early 40s when they were just being put into service. That is, when the first of them was just being demonstrated for service. World War II interfered with plans to build a whole fleet of these. The fleet was not built until after the war. And when they were built, they were all motor cars, whereas the original number 200 had been a trailer and somewhat shorter than the motor cars later would turn out to be. Some views of Jamaica again. Steam, electric, and diesel-drawn trains, all in a transitionary period. There's a G5 with a typical commuter train of that era. That train has several of the split-level cars. Notice that the second and third ones were in the two-tone gray livery already. This is at Kew Gardens, probably in the late 30s or early 40s. And this appears to be some station on the West Hempstead branch, single-track electrified line. Here we are at Country Life Press. That's a train of Long Island Railroad MP41s, the original electric MU cars, which were very, very similar to the IRT subway cars of the early 1900s. This train of full-size cars has just discharged any passengers who wanted to change here to the shuttle train. The train has come from Hempstead northward up the Hempstead branch and is taking the west leg of the Y, turning westward into the old central branch, which was, of course, the main part of the line through Garden City at this time and was considered part of the Hempstead branch. And that train would head westward through Garden City, through Stewart Manor, and other stations. Now we are on the shuttle train heading out eastward on the central branch. The train has started northward from the Hempstead branch and is turning eastward on the Y, leading onto the old central branch east of the crossing with the Hempstead branch. The central branch originally ran all the way to Bethpage, where it joined the branch from the main line going down toward Babylon. However, these views taken in the late 1940s show the line reduced to basically to single-track operation, although freight service was still run on the other track. And with the construction of the Meadowbrook and Wantagh Parkways, service was cut back to Mitchell Field on this line. There's Clinton Road Station, which was one of the major stations on this line, if it can be called that. Service was very light on this line due to very low demand and was provided by the shuttle train from Country Life Press. There's a freight train occupying the other track, probably bringing supplies out to Mitchell Field. There were several local stations on this line. Salisbury was beyond Mitchell Field. I doubt that service went any distance beyond that when these views were taken. That local station would have been between Clinton Road and Mitchell Field. This line is now out of service and is long considered abandoned. Electrification was removed many years ago after passenger service was discontinued. Another small local stop on the line. This appears to be the Mitchell Field station. Now we're at Rockaway Park, and we have some views of Long Island Railroad service to the Rockaways. Some Mack and GM buses of the 1940s period, and we're on the elevated station at Seaside here, the next station east of Rockaway Park, on the elevated structure which was built in the 1930s to replace operation of the Long Island Railroad's Rockaway divisions on the surface of the street. This train is coming eastbound up the ramp from Rockaway Park Terminal and up into the Seaside Station, first station on the elevated structure. Here we have some views of Long Island Railroad service on the elevated structure, which is today served by subway trains of the New York City Transit System. In May of 1950, a fire occurred on the trestle over Jamaica Bay from Hamilton Beach down to Rockaway, and this interrupted for all time Long Island Railroad service to the Rockaways via Jamaica Bay. However, the Long Island Railroad service to the Rockaways via Valley Stream continued to operate, and while the city of New York was rebuilding the causeway over Jamaica Bay for subway service, the Rockaway stations continued to be serviced by Long Island Railroad trains operating from Rockaway Park through Hamels and through Far Rockaway and around the Far Rockaway division into Valley Stream and to Penn Station or Flatbush Avenue the long way around. Here's a train coming around the single track leg of the Hamels Y, connecting the two double track branches, and farther along going toward Far Rockaway on the double track viaduct built in the late 1930s. The position light signal, of course, was Pennsylvania Railroad style. The timber trestle over Jamaica Bay had several interruptions by fire, the one in 1950 being the last one, probably the third or fourth, and the Long Island Railroad was in no financial condition to rebuild it any longer, especially since the peak demand for service was seasonal. So they gave up the service over Jamaica Bay and sold the entire Rockaway line within the city of New York, including the elevated structure on Rockaway itself and the Jamaica Bay Causeway, to the city of New York for something like $8 million. The city continued to permit the Long Island Railroad to serve the Rockaways via the Far Rockaway division, while it rebuilt the Jamaica Bay Causeway over the bay for subway service. This view is looking north from Hamilton Beach. There is a Rockaway train which can no longer go to Rockaway, because even though the causeway, the trestle work from Hamilton Beach down to Rockaway burned up and was abandoned, Long Island Railroad trains continued to serve that portion of the Jamaica Bay division on the mainland as far south as Hamilton Beach. This track is wrong railing from Hamilton Beach up through Howard Beach, and will continue up through Aqueduct and Ozone Park and so forth, joining the main line at Rego Park, and will continue on to Jamaica or perhaps Flatbush Avenue or Pennsylvania Station. This appears to be the old Howard Beach station. The motorman in his cab gives faithful service. Crossing over the Belt Parkway, we come up into the Aqueduct station adjacent to Aqueduct Racetrack. This was rebuilt in the late 1930s, along with building the bridges over the Cross Island or Belt Parkway. From the northbound Aqueduct platform, we look south at Long Island Railroad trains coming from Hamilton Beach up into Aqueduct, where subway trains now give service. North of Aqueduct Station, we see the steelwork being built in the middle 1950s to connect the Liberty Avenue BMT line with the Long Island Railroad's line south of Ozone Park for subway service via the A train, Fulton Street Subway, Euclid Avenue, Liberty Avenue line, and former Long Island Railroad track through the rebuilt causeway to Rockaway Park. There was the Woodhaven Junction, and here we have the Brooklyn Manor Station at Jamaica Avenue with the BMT Jamaica line overhead, operated by IND R10 type trains in this particular case. Here's a train of typical BMT 67-foot steel standard cars on the Jamaica line at Jamaica Avenue at Brooklyn Manor Station on the Long Island Railroad. There was no transfer station here between the BMT and the Long Island Railroad. Despite the fact that this service was cut back from the Rockaways and came only from Hamilton Beach, the service at Brooklyn Manor was still heavily in demand, as we see here, with a morning rush hour train picking up a load of passengers. Even after the service was further cut back to Ozone Park, after the subway opened up on the former Rockaway line, there was still some service on the former Rockaway branch just to Ozone Park. This is at Woodhaven Station on the Rockaway Beach Division. A southbound train bound for Hamilton Beach. More views of trains on the Rockaway Division here, apparently at Woodhaven Junction, where there's Woodhaven Tower, where the Atlantic Division connected with the Rockaway Beach Division. Woodhaven Junction again with a reduced to single track operation, with only a very few trains now operating via Flatbush Avenue, the Atlantic Division, and the connection into the Long Island Railroad Rockaway Beach Division down to either Ozone Park or Hamilton Beach. This is a Hamilton Beach bound train. And there is the steelwork of the structure connecting the IND subway with the Long Island Railroad. While trains of the Long Island Railroad continue to operate, this is a southbound train heading down to Hamilton Beach, where it will turn back and come north again through Ozone Park. There is a train of BMT C-types on the Liberty Avenue elevated line, going from Lefferts Avenue over toward East New York. There is the causeway being rebuilt by the City of New York, with sand and gravel and cement replacing the old timber trestle work. New drawbridges replacing the beach channel and broad channel draws. This is Rockaway Park Terminal, with a train leaving Rockaway Park. It had been reduced to 2 tracks and 2 platforms, although the City of New York would rebuild it for more stations, for more train service rather, with subway trains. Holland Station was on the elevated structure, and we have here Long Island Railroad service coming out of Rockaway Park, heading through Holland, through Hamels, and eastward to Far Rockaway, where the train will go the long way around through Valley Stream to either Brooklyn or Penn Station. One of the new swing bridges built by the City of New York at high level, and the concrete viaduct leading up to it, replacing the Long Island Railroad's old low-level swing bridge at the same location. Getting ready for subway service now to the Rockaways. It's 1955. And we're riding a subway train on the former Long Island Railroad's right-of-way across Jamaica Bay. We're arriving at Hamels on the Rockaway Peninsula. The line to the right leads over to Rockaway Park. The line to the left that we're following leads to Far Rockaway. As we will see, the Long Island Railroad line was severed at Far Rockaway from the Far Rockaway Division by removing the bridge over Mott Avenue. Consequently, the Long Island Railroad retained its Far Rockaway station on the ramp down to ground level for its own use, and the City of New York had to build a new Mott Avenue terminal, which is this station here. For a year or two, subway trains operated only to Wavecrest Station because the new terminal was not ready for them yet. But here the new terminal is open and in service. This is on the west side of Mott Avenue. The viaduct over Mott Avenue itself was removed, but if we look past the bumping block, we can see a Long Island Railroad train on its Far Rockaway station on the ramp up to the level of the concrete viaduct. So the two lines, the subway line on the old Long Island Railroad viaduct and the Long Island Railroad on its ramp, faced each other for some years. There is the Long Island Railroad's Far Rockaway station, now a terminal, and from the Far Rockaway station we look at the Far Rockaway Mott Avenue station on the subway line across the street. This situation continued briefly, and this is the Long Island Railroad's station at Far Rockaway, now used as a terminal, while a new terminal was being built for it on vacant land adjacent to it on the north side. That vacant land was where the Long Island Railroad had been on ground level before the elevated project of the 1930s took place. So the new station was being built back on ground level to replace the station on the elevated line, which had replaced an older station on ground level. Actually, the older station on ground level continued to serve the station platforms on the elevated line, but it was removed when the new station was opened. Here's construction work for the new tower, for the new station. There's Far Rockaway Tower, and there's the new station in place. Once trains began to serve the new station on ground level, the steel ramp leading up to the Far Rockaway viaduct, now served by subway trains, was removed. There's the new station. As seen from the level of the old station. And here is a train arriving at the new station on ground level, probably around 1958 or 59. This is seen from the old station up on the ramp, which had been truncated at Mott Avenue, and the ramp would soon be removed. A train leaves the Far Rockaway New Terminal and heads back toward Valley Stream. Now we have some views on the Long Island Railroad main line in the late 40s and early 50s. Most of the cars in this train are gray already, but there's one that was still in Tuscan red. We have a few views of the shop switcher in service at the Morris Park shops. This little, I believe it was battery operated locomotive, a little four-wheeler, was used to shunt passenger cars in and out of the repair bays and via the transfer table. There it is on the transfer table, making some moves back and forth. We'll see it pick up a dead passenger car, bring it onto the transfer table, and shunt it into one of the bays farther down the shop building. This appears to be number 322. And here it is with a dead car in tow, moving out from one of the shop tracks in the building onto the transfer table. Now the transfer table rolls down along the line of shop tracks, stops as directed, and the little shop locomotive pushes the car into one of the repair bays. Now from the 1950s we jump ahead to the 1960s. It's 1964, the second New York World's Fair is in operation at Flushing Meadows Park, and the Long Island Railroad is running its 50-cent shuttle trains between Pennsylvania Station and Willets Point, the World's Fair station. The cars have been painted up with a slogan on them: "Your steel throughway to the fair gateway." And the World's Fair, of course, is a story for another time. But here are the fairgrounds with the Long Island Railroad service, and the Long Island Railroad had an exhibit at the 1964 World's Fair: the cab of a diesel locomotive and the open platform end of a business car. So you could be photographed either as a locomotive engineer or a railway executive, as you chose. And a Long Island Railroad train which did not appear in the timetables, but which was a public train nonetheless, was this little, I think, 15-inch gauge amusement park train, painted up as a Long Island Railroad train and running on time. The orange and gray livery was typical of the Long Island Railroad in those years. Nostrand Avenue, the elevated station on the Flatbush Avenue line, the Brooklyn or Atlantic division, in the early 1960s, before rebuilding. The elevated line from the tunnel portal to East New York was built in the 1890s as the Atlantic Avenue Elevated, and served the Long Island Railroad after the tracks had been removed from the surface of Atlantic Avenue and put in tunnels in east and west ends and on the elevated structure between the two tunnels. Still at Nostrand Avenue. This line, of course, is still in service, but with much newer equipment and much newer rolling stock than we see here. Due to tight clearances in the tunnels and at the Flatbush Avenue terminal, the split-level cars were not used regularly on this line. In fact, the clearances had to be modified in this line to accommodate the M1 cars which the Metropolitan Transportation Authority ordered for the Long Island Railroad service in the late 1970s. This is at the other end of the Atlantic Avenue elevated line at East New York, where the trains dip down underground again for another underground run all the way out to Morris Park near Jamaica. The dark gray livery was the second of the gray versions, and eventually orange paint was added to the ends of the cars to give them greater visibility, both outdoors in dim light and in the tunnels. Some views at Jamaica. Those two cars with the yellow and red stripes at the bottom, and the other cars were the Long Island Railroad's first streamlined cars. The black ones came from the Kansas City Southern, the other two came from the New York Central, and they were first-class cars which the Long Island Railroad gutted and replaced with coach seats for the Long Island Railroad's first modern post-war equipment. That is streamlined train equipment rather than the 1950s built cars which were of conventional construction. More cars were needed both to replace worn out old equipment and to add cars to trains existing for the heavier and heavier service required as more and more passengers were using the Long Island Railroad in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, with all the housing development going on in Nassau County and also in Suffolk later on. An eastbound train leaving Jamaica and a westbound train coming through Forest Hills comprising new equipment. Here's an eastbound train with a split-level car on the front end and two more on the rear, passing through Forest Hills. A similar westbound train. And in the vicinity of Kew Gardens, we see some Long Island Railroad trains of newer equipment built in the 1950s, as well as the older equipment with which it could operate in multiple, such as the last two cars on this train. This is at Westbridge, which had been a Long Island Railroad local station on the main line, where the main line crossed Jamaica Avenue and passed under the BMT line. That little building in the center of the picture there was the Westbridge Station House. The station was abandoned in the late 1930s, and the platforms up at track level were long since removed, but the little building remained in service as a taxicab office for some time after that. This is at the Atlantic divisions near the division near the tunnel portal near Morris Park. The coaling towers were still standing at this time on the left, probably used as sand towers for the diesel locomotives. Here we are at Woodside in the late 1960s or early 1970s with the World's Fair R36 cars on the Flushing line overhead. The two nearer tracks here are the Port Washington division. The other four tracks are the main line, and each of these two divisions has its own adjacent station at Woodside. On the right there is an inbound Port Washington train. On the left is an inbound mainline train. There's an outbound mainline express and an outbound Port Washington express. On the right, an outbound Port Washington train. Here's a through train, diesel hauled, with various cars, including some former Boston and Maine cars in the train. Those round roof cars with the rounded ends are the former Boston and Maine cars, acquired by the Long Island Railroad for additional passenger capacity in the 1960s. Another outbound through train comprising mostly newer equipment, and a train of M1s on the local track. These are views now in the early 1970s. This is May 1974 at Woodside. The M1s have taken over most of the service supplied by the older MUs. The R36s were still operating on the Flushing IRT line overhead. Early one morning in the middle 1970s at Woodside, this time seen from the IRT station overhead, looking down on the Long Island Railroad with two Manhattan-bound trains heading west on the main line. There's a Boston and Maine car still in the dark gray livery, and a commuter club car, that parlor car on the end with the air conditioning duct added to its old-style railroad roof. The Long Island Railroad's freight service has fluctuated over the years. In some eras, it was much more important and heavier than in other eras. When the Metropolitan Transportation Authority took over the Long Island Railroad, they assumed operation of its freight service. And these are views at Sunnyside with the Pennsylvania, or Penn Central rather, GG1s in service, being serviced and turned at Sunnyside Yard, and Long Island Railroad freight locomotive passing by in the foreground. Notice the train of Pennsylvania Railroad cars still unrepainted into Penn Central livery, still in the Tuscan red with the Keystone PRR emblems. An outbound Long Island Railroad train, and another one. In the distance is the Diagonal Street Bridge with the IRT Flushing line overhead on it, leading from Queensboro Plaza to Queens Boulevard. A Long Island Railroad diesel-drawn train from either Hunters Point or Long Island City. There is a former Boston and Maine car in the train. There's another one at the rear end of the train. These Boston and Maine cars were similar to the New Haven Railroad's 1938 streamlined cars, except that they did not originally have skirts below floor level as the New Haven cars did. There's the Long Island Railroad Commuter Club car on the back of that train, an old-style parlor car fitted up with air conditioning and chartered to a commuter group. Long Island City was the Long Island Railroad's old waterfront terminal. The ferries to East 34th Street, Manhattan had stopped running in 1925. They continued to operate even after the opening of the tunnels to Pennsylvania Station in 1910. The Long Island City Terminal continued to be in use to handle overflow trains that could not be accommodated by the East River tunnels into Pennsylvania Station. A few passengers continued to use the service, although many of these trains were deadhead runs. The station area was used as a storage yard for trains which originated either at Jamaica or at Hunters Point being near the tunnel portals on the main line close to Sunnyside Yard. A few of these trains ran via the Montauk Division carrying passengers in service. In general, they were Oyster Bay trains from Long Island City through Jamaica to Oyster Bay via the Montauk Division. Trains leaving Long Island City, as this train is doing, could take the switches at the fork right at this crossing near Borden Avenue and operate to Hunters Point, as that train is doing, and join the main line there, or could operate via the Montauk Division by way of the tracks in the foreground. At one time, the Long Island City Terminal was electrified with third rail, but that had been removed by the time these pictures were taken in the mid-1970s. That train is leaving Long Island City Terminal and is heading eastbound on the Montauk Division. What appears to be a locomotive on the back of the train is a former locomotive from which the traction motors were removed, leaving the diesel motor in the car body to operate, generating electricity to operate the heating and lighting equipment in the train, thereby saving the output of the actual locomotive on the front end of the train for tractive purposes. Looking up the connection between Long Island City and Hunters Point, and an outbound train leaving Long Island City with the Empire State Building and Manhattan Way in the background right in the center. There's another one of those Power Pack X locomotives on the rear of that train. That train has gone up the connection to the main line at Hunters Point. This train is leaving via the Montauk Division, and now we look at some of the stations on the Montauk Division which still had passenger service in September and October 1979 when these views were taken. This is at Penny Bridge, one of the little communities in Queens along the old Montauk Division, which, by the way, was never electrified. All service on this line was either steam or diesel. One or two trains in each rush hour continued to serve the Montauk Division stations for any passengers who chose to use them, although service was very, very light, and so was demand in the passenger stations on this line. Notice the steep grade coming eastbound from Penny Bridge up to Haberman Station on the Montauk Division. Notice also the absence of third rail. This train is in service, picking up passengers at these local stations and discharging anyone who wishes to get off there. The train is a through train to Oyster Bay via Jamaica. In addition to these trains making regular stops, a good many trains deadheaded from Long Island City to Jamaica via the Montauk Division, not stopping at any of the stations, and then began their operation in service at Jamaica. Fresh Pond Station was the junction with not only the Bushwick branch but also with the New York Connecting Railroad, which led into the Bay Ridge Division. That view was looking west, and we're swinging around toward the east now. Fresh Pond Station was in the cut, and there are some freight cars being switched into an industry adjacent to the Fresh Pond Station. That truss bridge in the background there is the New York Connecting Railroad at Fresh Pond Junction, and immediately to this side of it is a smaller bridge carrying the BMT's Myrtle Avenue elevated line over the Long Island Railroad's Montauk Division. Earlier in the view, you saw a steam-powered train coming off the Montauk Division westbound into the Bay Ridge Division southbound. Now we have an eastbound train stopping at Fresh Pond and heading east. Although the line was double track, the trains could operate in either direction on either track depending upon how the dispatchers set things up. There's the eastbound train heading for Jamaica, crossing underneath the New York Connecting Railroad's truss bridge. And an M train on the Myrtle Avenue elevated line, stainless steel 60-foot cars this time, from the Broadway Jamaica line at the Myrtle and Broadway junction of the two lines. These views were taken in 1979, by which the lower portion of the Myrtle Avenue L had been abandoned about 10 years already. Glendale is a little enclave in Queens, a residential area served by the Montauk Division, with 1 or 2 trains a day in each direction, stopping at Glendale, in addition, of course, to the deadhead trains operating through without passengers. Beyond Glendale, the Montauk Division runs through Forest Park, a major public park in Queens, and emerges at Richmond Hill. These are views in the Forest Park area, crossing the Interborough Parkway, which also runs through Forest Park. Running through Forest Park, the Montauk Division emerges at Richmond Hill, and this is looking westward from the Richmond Hill station at an eastbound train, with the BMT Broadway Jamaica line crossing over it near Lefferts Boulevard, or Lefferts Avenue. This was an early grade crossing elimination. The track level was raised from ground level up to an elevated viaduct with an island platform, high-level platform station at Richmond Hill, right near Lefferts Boulevard, and this was done in the early 1910s, so that when the BMT Broadway Jamaica line was built, it had to be built very high to cross over the Long Island Railroad as well as over the street in this area. That hand-lettered sign there was a stopgap measure. Apparently the proper station signs had been vandalized or otherwise removed. Stairway from the island platform down to street level. There were no ticket agents at any of the stations on the Montauk Division in the 1970s when these views were taken. All tickets had to be bought on the train for those who rode this line. This is crossing Metropolitan Avenue near Lefferts Boulevard, and here we have transit on 3 levels, a local bus on the street, Long Island Railroad train on the 2nd level, and a BMT subway train on the third elevated level. Another BMT train as seen from the Long Island Railroad's Richmond Hill Station. Another view of the three levels there. Looking north on Lefferts Boulevard, there's a Long Island train which has stopped at Richmond Hill Station and now is heading eastward toward Jamaica, where it will continue on to Oyster Bay. The same train heading eastward from Richmond Hill passes the old Long Island Railroad's Richmond Hill Freight Yard, which was no longer in service as a freight yard by this time. Any of its tracks that remained were simply used for storage of bad order cars or surplus equipment. But there once was a freight yard here with team tracks for the pickup and delivery of freight. '89th Avenue, where the Long Island Railroad's Montauk Division crosses over a flooded street in this view. There's the remains of the Richmond Hill Freight Yard with surplus equipment and storage and trains passing back and forth on the Montauk Division between Richmond Hill and Jamaica. Dunton Tower, where the Montauk Division joins the main line just west of Jamaica in the vicinity of the Morris Park shops and yards. As seen from Atlantic Avenue, the street in the foreground, looking eastward. An Atlantic Division train heading into its tunnel toward East New York and Flatbush Avenue. And a Montauk Division train coming in on the flyover, joining the main line and the Atlantic Division just west of Jamaica Station. And thus we bring to a close our survey of the Long Island Railroad from the 1940s through the 1970s.